The air inside Mr. Caldwell's law office was heavy with the scent of polished oak, aged paper, and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco, the kind that seemed to linger in the fibers of furniture long after the smoker had gone. Outside, the late summer heat shimmered across the dusty main street of Preston Creek, Texas, but in here, the thick curtains and the slow-turning brass ceiling fan gave the room a stillness, almost like time had stopped to watch what was about to unfold. Henry Dawson sat stiffly in the high-backed leather chair opposite the desk, his hands gripping his battered cowboy hat as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the moment, his boots muddy from the morning's ride into town. Rest square on the carpet, though his right heel tapped a nervous, irregular beat against the floorboards beneath. He had been summoned here without explanation, just a curt letter from Mr. Caldwell's assistant telling him to be in attendance at precisely 10 a.m. to hear the reading of his late uncle's will. Henry had expected to walk in, sign some papers, maybe nod through a list of assets, and walk out the new owner of Dawson Rancha, sprawling, weather-worn cattle empire worth more than he could comprehend. After all, he was the only living heir. But now, as Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles, Henry could feel in his bones that something unexpected was coming. The lawyer's desk was a fortress of paperwork, neatly stacked, ledgers, and the green-shaded lamp that cast its light over the central document, the will itself, written in the precise, looping script of his uncle's generation. Henry's eyes drifted toward the old grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging with hypnotic steadiness, the only real sound in the room besides Caldwell's measured breathing. He could feel the tension gathering like storm clouds. His uncle, Bartholomew Dawson, had been a man of unpredictable whims. In his lifetime, he had been part rancher, part showman, part cunning businessman, and part eccentric old fool who loved nothing more than setting impossible challenges for the people around him. More than once, Henry had seen him change the entire course of a cattle drive on a dare, or refuse to sell prime breeding stock just because a buyer's handshake felt wrong. It was just like Uncle Bart to leave something in the will that would be unconventional. Caldwell began to read aloud in a voice that was dry, deliberate, and unhurried, the words rolling out like a slow river. To my nephew, Henry James Dawson, I leave the Dawson Ranch, with all livestock, equipment, land, and holdings, valued at approximately $1,124,645, as well as the Dawson family homestead, and all associated titles. Henry's heart gave a little leap. Yes, here it was. Everything his uncle had built, all those acres of sun-bleached grassland, the barns, the herds, they would be his. But then Caldwell paused, a faint, almost apologetic crease forming between his brows. He looked up briefly over the top of his spectacles before continuing. On the condition, he said, that within 1 year of the date of this reading, Henry James Dawson shall enter into lawful matrimony with not one, not two, but 3 women, each of whom shall be. Caldwell stopped to squint down at the exact phrasing, in good health, of sound mind, and of generous proportion. Henry blinked. For a long moment the words didn't seem to register. The air in the office thickened. The steady ticking of the grandfather clock suddenly felt louder, sharper. He swallowed, but his throat had gone dry as desert dust. 3 wives. And not just any 3 women. His uncle had apparently gone so far as to specify their size. Henry's mind spun like a spooked stallion, bucking against the reins of logic. He knew his uncle had been eccentric, but this was something else entirely. A prank. No, Caldwell was reading it straight from the will, every word solemn and binding. Henry's pulse drummed in his ears. The Dawson Ranch, the land his father and grandfather had worked before him, the only life he knew, was dangling in front of him like a carrot on a stick. But the string holding it was knotted into the most bizarre requirement imaginable. Caldwell, perhaps sensing the shock settling over his client, set the paper down gently and laced his fingers together atop the desk. Your uncle, he said, carefully, was very clear on this matter. No marriage, no ranch. The unions must be legally recognized, consummated, and ongoing at the time of the 1-year mark. If any one of the 3 wives divorces you or leaves before that time, the inheritance is forfeit and the ranch will pass to the Preston Creek Historical Society for. He glanced again at the paper. Educational cattle preservation purposes. Henry stared at the lawyer as though he'd just grown antlers. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a ridiculous image flickered. The Dawson Ranch gates painted bright red and tourists strolling through with cotton candy, gawking at longhorns like they were circus animals. He wanted to laugh, Lord. He wanted to, but the weight of reality pressed too hard against his chest. This was his family's legacy. This was his life's work. And now, thanks to his uncle's meddling from beyond the grave, it was tangled in a knot of matrimony and stipulation. That sounded more like the plot of a bad dime store novel than a legal document. His fingers tightened around his hat brim until the leather creaked. The lawyer's voice was still speaking, outlining timelines, legal procedures. The fact that he could not simply hire 3 stand-ins for the sake of ceremony. They had to be real marriages, recognized by the county and the state. Every word landed heavier than the last. Henry barely heard the end of it. Something about witness signatures and a notarized agreement. His mind was too busy wrestling with the enormity of what had just been placed in his hands, and the sheer absurdity of the path ahead. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the window panes somewhere far off. The distant lowing of cattle drifted into town, a sound Henry had always found steadying, grounding. But now it only reminded him of what was at stake. Of the million-dollar empire that could slip through his fingers if he didn't do the unthinkable. He sat there in that chair, staring at the desk, the will, the lawyer, as if by sheer force of will he could make the condition vanish. But the paper was real. The ink was real, and so was the deadline. The days following the reading of his grandfather's will were nothing short of surreal for Daniel Whitaker. He had grown up on the sprawling Whitaker Ranch, a place where the air smelled of mesquite, the horses knew their names, and the wind whispered across thousands of acres like a lullaby of the past. Yet, after his parents' untimely deaths, and later the death of his grandfather, Daniel had spent the last several years living far from the land that had been his birthright. He'd worked odd jobs in nearby towns, living in small rented rooms, avoiding the place entirely not because he didn't love it, but because it was too tangled with grief and the haunting memory of the people he'd lost. Now, he was being told that this entire property, worth millions, could be his. On one unthinkable condition, he must marry 3 plus-sized women. Not 1, not 2, 3. When the lawyer had first read that stipulation aloud, the room went silent, as though even the dust motes in the air had stopped drifting. Daniel sat still in the heavy leather chair, his eyes fixed on the desk, as if staring at the oak grain might make the words go away. But they didn't. They were etched in. Legal terms on crisp paper, signed by his grandfather, sealed with authority. The absurdity of it clashed violently with the seriousness of the setting. Behind the lawyer's tidy desk, the tall windows let in sunlight that fell over rows of law books. The ticking of an antique clock the only sound. Daniel's first instinct had been anger-hot searing and directed at the man who had raised him. He remembered his grandfather, Jeremiah Whitaker, as stern but fair, a man who believed a handshake was a stronger bond than any paper contract. Why would such a man, who had taught Daniel about integrity, hard work, and honesty, attach such a humiliating, bizarre condition to his will? Was this some kind of twisted joke, a test of endurance? Or worse, a way to mock him from beyond the grave? The lawyer, a thin, precise man named Mr. Carver, pushed his glasses higher on his nose and cleared his throat before elaborating. Grandfather's intention, Mr. Whitaker, as far as I can gather from his notes, was to challenge your preconceived notions about companionship, partnership, and value in human relationships. He believed you might be inclined toward how should I say shallow choices. He wanted to ensure you saw worth where the world might overlook it. The words landed like stones. Daniel wanted to protest, to say that his grandfather had no right to make such judgments about him. But deep inside, a pang of guilt whispered. In his younger years, he had been known among his peers for dating women who fit the conventional ideals of beauty: slim, toned, fashionably dressed. He'd never considered himself shallow, but had he ever truly looked beyond the surface? Still, marrying 3 women, and specifically 3 plus-sized women, wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. How would such a marriage even work? Would the women be strangers, or would his grandfather have already chosen them? What if they didn't want to marry him? The legalities alone would be a nightmare, not to mention the emotional implications. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He returned to his rented room above the hardware store in town, lay on his narrow bed, and stared at the ceiling. The hum of the ceiling fan became a backdrop to his spinning thoughts. The ranch had been in his family for generations. To lose it would mean more than losing a piece of land. It would be like letting go of his roots, the place where his bloodline had lived, worked, and died. He pictured the open fields in spring, the cattle grazing along the horizon, the creek that cut through the property, its waters cold and clear even in midsummer. He remembered the barn where he'd learned to ride a horse, the old oak tree where his parents had carved their initials when they were young and in love. Could he really walk away from all of that, just to avoid fulfilling an unusual condition? But then came the other question: was he prepared to walk into a marriage, or rather, 3 marriages under such circumstances? What would the women think of him? Would they see him as a man desperate to claim a fortune? Or could genuine bonds form from something that started so artificially? The prospect made his stomach knot over the next few days. Daniel tried to go about his normal routine, but the will's condition followed him everywhere, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. When he went to the cafe for breakfast, he caught himself glancing at people differently, wondering what they would think if they knew his situation. When he walked past the old church, he thought about weddings and the vows people made there, how sacred they were supposed to be. He began replaying conversations with his grandfather in his mind, looking for clues. There had been a time, years ago, when Jeremiah had taken him aside and said, "A man's worth isn't measured by the beauty he claims, but by the beauty he cultivates in others." Daniel had nodded at the time, not fully understanding. Now those words carried weight, but they also came with a heavy price tag: 3 wedding rings, 3 promises, 3 lives intertwined with his. On the 4th day after the reading of the will, Daniel returned to Mr. Carver's office. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked. Mr. Carver didn't hesitate. "The ranch will pass to the next eligible heir, which, in this case, would be your cousin, Wyatt. I should note, Mr. Whitaker, that your grandfather had no great faith in Wyatt's management abilities. I suspect that's why this stipulation was directed at you instead." Daniel's jaw tightened. Wyatt was reckless, more interested in gambling than in cattle. If Wyatt inherited the ranch, it would be sold off in pieces within a year. The thought twisted in Daniel's gut like barbed wire. That night, as he walked home under a sky thick with stars, Daniel realized he was at a crossroads. The choice before him was not just about land or money, it was about legacy, responsibility, and perhaps even love in its most unexpected form. Whether his grandfather's challenge was cruel or wise remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: if he chose to accept it, his life would never be the same. The air in the small ranch house felt heavy that morning, as if it carried the weight of both history and decision. James sat at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped loosely around a chipped coffee mug. The rich, dark liquid inside had long since cooled, but he barely noticed. His mind was replaying the events of the past 2 days, the reading of his uncle's will, the bizarre stipulation, the faces of the 3 women he had only glimpsed in an old photograph, and the gnawing sense that his life was being pushed toward some unfamiliar cliff edge. The quiet was broken by the low, steady hum of an approaching engine. It was a sound that didn't belong to a tractor or a pickup truck from around here. It was smoother, more precise, the kind of vehicle sound that suggested pressed suits and polished shoes rather than mud-caked boots. James rose, his instincts sharpening. Sure enough, moments later, a sleek black sedan rolled up the dusty driveway, a stark contrast to the faded wooden rails of the ranch fence. From the driver's seat emerged Mr. Howard Carmichael, the lawyer who had delivered the shocking news just days before. He was tall and thin, with silver hair that caught the early light, and a briefcase so immaculate it looked like it had never touched the floor of a barn. James could tell from the way the man's eyes scanned the property, noting every weather beam, every patch of grass, that he wasn't here for casual conversation. "Mr. Colton," the lawyer greeted, stepping forward with a controlled smile. His tone was formal but tinged with something else, curiosity, perhaps even a bit of wariness. "May I come in?" James nodded and led him inside, gesturing to the seat opposite him at the table. Carmichael sat with the precision of a man who calculated even his posture. He set the briefcase down, opened it with a crisp click, and pulled out several thick folders. "I'll be direct," Carmichael began. "The clock is already ticking. Your uncle's will leaves you the Colton Ranch, valued at approximately $1.2 million, along with its surrounding grazing rights, but, as you know, the inheritance comes with one unusual condition." James gave a short laugh without humor. "Unusual? You mean the part where I have to marry 3 women I've never met in order to get it? That's not unusual, Mr. Carmichael, that's insane." The lawyer didn't flinch. "It is, indeed, unconventional, but legally binding, unless you wish to contest a will in court. And if you do, there's a good chance the property will be tied up for years, possibly awarded to distant relatives who have already expressed interest." James leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "And these women, they're not even local, right? My uncle, he just picked them. Out of where? A catalog?" Carmichael's expression tightened. "Not exactly. All 3 of them, Ms. Beatrice Langley, Ms. Charlotte Boone, and Ms. Agnes Merriweather, have connections to your uncle's past. They are not strangers to him, even if they are strangers to you. He described them in his will as loyal women deserving of comfort and stability in their later years." James felt the words land in his chest like stones. So this wasn't a random whim. His uncle had reasons. Reasons James might never fully understand. Still, the idea of being pushed into marriage, 3 marriages as a prerequisite for owning his birthright, made his skin prickle. Carmichael continued, shuffling papers. "The will also stipulates that you must live here on the ranch with all 3 brides for no less than 5 years. You are to provide them with care, respect, and equal partnership in the household. Should any of them voluntarily leave within that period, you will still retain ownership. But if you drive them away, or dissolve the arrangement, the ranch reverts to the secondary heirs. 5 years. The number echoed in James's head like the toll of a distant bell. 5 years of living in what could easily become a domestic powder keg. He pictured tense dinners, awkward silences, conflicting personalities. Yet, beneath all that, another image formed: the ranch, thriving again. Horses in the fields, the smell of fresh hay, the home he had dreamed of saving from foreclosure. Since he was a boy, the lawyer's voice cut through his thoughts. "I should also note, Mr. Colton, that each of these women has agreed to the arrangement. They are aware of the will's conditions and have signed preliminary consent forms. They will be arriving in 3 days. 3 days." James repeated, his stomach-dropping. "I haven't even agreed yet. That's why I'm here," Carmichael replied calmly. "To answer questions, and to remind you of the deadline. If you choose to proceed, I'll require your signature today on these acceptance papers." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying the scent of earth and the faint trace of rain far off in the hills. James felt the old ranch walls around him, the place where his uncle had taught him to ride, where his father had once fixed fences by hand, where the kitchen still held the faint stain of coffee spills from decades past. Finally, James spoke, his voice low. "Tell me about them. These women." Carmichael nodded, as though expecting the question. He opened a file and began to describe each one. Beatrice, widowed young, known for her stubborn resilience and quick wit. Charlotte, a gifted cook, whose baking was legendary in her county. Agnes, a retired schoolteacher with a sharp mind and an iron sense of fairness. All of them were described as plus-sized in the will, not as an insult, but, Carmichael insisted, as a simple fact. "Your uncle," Carmichael added, "believed beauty was found in kindness, loyalty, and strength, not in the inches of a waistline." He often spoke against the world's shallow measures. I think this stipulation was his way of making a point. James felt something shift inside him. He remembered his uncle's voice, rough with age but always warm, telling him that a man's worth was measured by the way he treated others, especially those society overlooked. The lawyer slid the papers toward him. "You don't have to decide with your heart today, Mr. Colton, you only have to decide with your hand." James stared at the pen lying across the dotted line. The weight of the ranch's history seemed to press down on him, mingling with the strange, almost poetic justice of the will. 3 women, 3 stories, 3 lives about to collide with his dot. The moment stretched. In that silence, he could almost hear his uncle's laugh. Deep and knowing, as though the old man had been planning this twist for years. And for the first time since the reading of the will, James realized he wasn't just deciding whether to keep the ranch, he was deciding the course of his own life. The night had grown deep, and the once lively ranch had fallen into a tense, watchful silence. From the outside, it might have appeared like any other quiet evening in the countryside, crickets chirping in the grass, the wind rustling the leaves, and the distant call of a night bird echoing from somewhere beyond the pastures. But inside the main house, the atmosphere was taut as a rope stretched to its limit. Jack sat at the long oak table, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Across from him, the 3 women, Rosie, Clara, and May, sat in an awkward row, each with her own mix of emotions flickering across her face. They weren't strangers anymore. Not after the strange weeks they had spent together on the ranch. But they weren't yet bound by the decision that loomed over them like a heavy, immovable shadow. Earlier that day, Jack had received the formal notice from the lawyer. The deadline was approaching. In just 3 days, if he hadn't married all 3 women, the ranch's grandfather's sprawling, sun-soaked land that had been in the family for generations would pass into the hands of distant relatives who had never even set foot on it. The terms were absurd to anyone hearing them for the first time, but they had been laid out clearly in the old man's will. The 3 brides weren't a punishment. They were, in his grandfather's words, the key to saving the land. No one knew exactly what he had meant, though whispers around town suggested that each woman represented an unspoken promise his grandfather had made long ago, promises to protect certain families, promises to heal old feuds, promises to keep the land from being swallowed by greedy outsiders. Jack had spent days trying to avoid the thought of marriage. It wasn't that Rosie, Clara, or May were unpleasant. They each had their own kind of beauty, humor, and strength, but marriage, to him, was sacred. He had always imagined it would come from love, not a legal loophole in a will. And yet, the reality of the ranch's future loomed over him like a storm cloud. Losing the ranch meant losing not just his home, but the livelihood of the workers who depended on it, the horses that roamed the pastures, and the hundreds of acres of open sky that had been his only constant companion since childhood. That night, as they sat around the table, the air between them carried the weight of everything unspoken. Rosie, the eldest of the 3, and perhaps the boldest, broke the silence first. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Jack's, and said, "You can't keep putting this off. We all know what's at stake." Her voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the firmness of someone used to making decisions. Rosie had a way of commanding a room not through force, but through presence. Even before all of this, she had been a force in the local community, running her family's bakery and taking care of her younger siblings after their parents passed. She wasn't the type to shy away from hard truths, and tonight was no different. Clara, on the other hand, sat quietly, her fingers tracing patterns in the wood grain of the table. She was the softest spoken of the 3, but Jack had learned that her silence wasn't emptiness, it was depth. When she did speak, her words carried a weight that lingered long after they were spoken. Clara's history with the ranch was more personal than the others. Her father had once been foreman here, working side by side with Jack's grandfather. She remembered summers spent chasing chickens in the yard, afternoons swimming in the creek, and evenings when the whole ranch crew gathered for barbecues under strings of lights. For her, the idea of losing the ranch was like losing a piece of her own history. May was different, still quick-witted, sharp-tongued, and unafraid to call things as she saw them. She had been a traveling performer before settling in the nearby town, her life full of constant motion until the ranch had unexpectedly tethered her here. She was the one who had laughed the first time she heard the terms of the will, declaring it the most ridiculous romance novel plot to ever hit real life. But beneath her humor was a sharp awareness of what the ranch meant to Jack and, surprisingly, to herself. She'd grown used to the wide skies and the steady rhythm of life here, things she hadn't even realized she was craving until they became part of her days. Jack's mind churned as he looked at each of them. He thought about the hundreds of mornings he had woken before dawn to feed the horses, the long hours in the sun repairing fences, the quiet moments on the porch watching the light fade over the fields. He thought about how this land had been wrestled from the wild by his grandfather's bare hands, how every post and beam told a story, how the soil itself felt like it carried the memory of the man who raised him. And then he thought about the three women sitting before him not as obstacles or pawns in some strange inheritance scheme, but as people who had, in their own ways, already become part of the ranch's heartbeat. But doubt gnawed at him. Was it fair to marry without love? Was it fair to tie their lives together out of necessity rather than desire? Rosie's gaze didn't waver. Clara's quiet patience held steady, and May's smirk softened into something that almost looked like hope. Jack felt the enormity of the choice pressing down on him. I need to know something, he finally said, his voice low. If I do this, if we do this, if can't just be about saving the land. I can't trap any of you in something you'll regret. His words hung in the air, heavy and sincere. Rosie was the first to respond. Jack, life doesn't always hand us the love story we dreamed of. Sometimes, it hands us the chance to build something together. And maybe, just maybe, that can be enough. Clara gave the smallest of nods, her eyes warm but unreadable. May leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Look, Cowboy, we're all grown adults. We know what we're signing up for. The question is, do you? Jack looked down at his clasped hands. The choice was his, and it had to be made soon. The ticking clock in the hallway sounded louder than it had all night, each tick like the drumbeat of fate closing in. And somewhere, in the dark outside, the ranch waited silent, watchful, and in need of someone to fight for it. The turning point came on a blistering afternoon in late July. The sky was a bleached, merciless blue, the kind that burned the eyes if you looked up for too long, and the air shimmered above the dry earth as though the land itself was breathing out heat. Jacob had been working since sunrise, mending the far fence line with Ruth. The posts were old, weathered to a silver gray, and many were split at the base where years of storms had gnawed at them. Sweat poured down his back and soaked through his shirt until it clung to him like a second skin. His hands were blistered from the post-hole digger, and every muscle in his arms screamed for rest. But the thought of leaving the job was worse than the ache in his body. Emily had insisted on repairing this section before the next cattle drive, saying a single stray steer could mean hundreds of dollars lost, and on a ranch where every cent had to be earned with sweat, that wasn't a risk worth taking. But she'd underestimated just how bad the fence had gotten, and the work dragged on far longer than anyone had planned. By midday, Ruth's face was flushed red under her wide-brimmed hat, and Jacob had to insist she sit in the shade for a while, though she protested with a stubborn shake of her head. She was quiet as always, but her eyes held a kind of determination that made it clear she wasn't there just to watch. She was pulling her weight as much as he was. They'd barely gotten the third post set when Sarah came riding up on her chestnut mare, dust trailing behind her like a storm cloud. She swung off the horse in one motion, her eyes sharp with the kind of urgency Jacob had come to recognize. "We've got trouble," she said, not wasting time on pleasantries. Cattle broke through the east pasture. "Looks like a section of fence is down, and it's not the wind this time. Someone cut it." The words hit Jacob harder than he expected. He'd heard about fence-cutting wars in ranch country, disputes between neighbors, cattle thieves, or even hired hands with grudges. Out here, a broken fence wasn't just property damage. It was an act of aggression. Whoever had done it wasn't just trying to steal cattle, they were making a statement. Emily arrived moments later, her face pale but composed, riding hard. "Despite the heat, we can't afford to lose that herd," she said, her voice firm. "Jacob, Sarah, you're with me. Ruth, get water and supplies ready in case this turns ugly." They rode fast, the horses' hooves pounding over the hard earth, the sun beating down on their backs. Jacob's mind raced. He'd been on the ranch barely a few weeks, but already he felt the protective instinct rising in him. This wasn't about the will anymore. It wasn't about money or marriage conditions. The idea that someone could come onto their land, cut their fences, and try to take what they'd worked for stirred something deep in his chest, a quiet fury he didn't even know he was capable of. When they reached the east pasture, the sight made his jaw tighten. A 30-foot section of fence lay trampled in the dirt, the wire slack and twisted. Beyond it, the cattle milled nervously, a few already straying toward the tree line where the land dipped into a shallow creek. Sarah swung off her horse and inspected the wire. "Clean cut," she said, holding up the severed end. "Fresh, too. Whoever did this was here less than an hour ago." Emily scanned the horizon, her hand resting on the rifle slung over her saddle. "Jacob, help me get the herd back inside. Sarah, keep watch." They worked quickly, maneuvering the animals with practiced shouts and sweeps of their arms, funneling them back toward the repaired section of fence. Jacob had never handled cattle under this kind of pressure before, and every second felt like a balancing act between control and chaos. One wrong move and the entire herd could bolt. They managed to get the last steer inside when Sarah called out sharply, "Riders." 3 figures emerged from the scrub about 100 yards away, their horses moving at an unhurried pace that spoke of confidence, maybe even arrogance. They were dressed like ranch hands, but the way they carried themselves made Jacob's gut tighten. One of them, a tall man with a black hat pulled low, called out, "Fence looked like it needed fixing." His tone dripped with mockery. Emily didn't flinch. "You're on Carter land," she said, her voice cutting through the heat. "Turn around and you won't have trouble." The man in the black hat smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Trouble's already here." For a long moment, no one moved. Jacob's heart pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm, watching Emily for cues. She was steady, her hand near her rifle but not yet drawing it. The standoff stretched until finally, the riders turned their horses and rode away, disappearing over the ridge without another word. It should have been a relief, but Jacob knew this wasn't over. The cut fence, the mocking words, this was the opening move in something larger. As they rode back to the main house, dust swirling in their wake, he realized the truth. The ranch wasn't just being tested from within. There were enemies outside the gates, and they wouldn't wait for him to figure out where he stood. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, the moonlight silvering the land, and thought about everything that had happened. The will's strange condition had brought him here, but it was loyalty, not obligation, that kept him now. And loyalty meant one thing. When the next fight came, he'd be ready, not for the ranch's sake alone, but for the women who had become, against all odds, his responsibility. The day after the fence-cutting incident, the ranch felt different. It wasn't just the physical work of repairing the east pasture or the memory of the 3 strangers. Riding off with their smug grins, it was the weight of something unspoken. That lingered in the air. Jacob noticed at first in the way Emily's eyes narrowed when she looked across the horizon, as though she were counting the ridges and washes where trouble might come from. He saw it in Sarah too, though her way of showing it was different. She was quieter than usual, her energy focused, her movements sharp and economical. And Ruth, she didn't say much, but there was a softness in her gaze whenever Jacob caught her watching him, as though she knew he was already carrying more than he'd bargained for. That night, after supper, the 4 of them sat in the main room, the lamplight flickering against the log walls. Outside, the wind stirred through the cottonwoods by the creek, making a sound like distant whispers. They'd eaten in near silence roast beef with potatoes and gravy, cornbread still warm from the oven, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet they sometimes shared. This one had an edge to it, a tension that hummed beneath the surface. Finally, Emily set down her coffee cup and spoke. "They'll be back." It wasn't a prediction, it was a certainty. Her voice was calm, but it carried a steel Jacob had come to recognize. That cut fence wasn't about stealing a few head of cattle. It was about sending a message. Whoever's behind it wants us rattled before they make their real move. Sarah leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "And we're short-handed. We can't cover the whole ranch 24 hours a day. Even if we could, we don't know which direction they'll come from next." Jacob knew she was right. The Carter Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres open prairie, scrubland pockets of wooded draws. Fences stretched for miles in every direction, and each one was both a boundary and a vulnerability. Even with 4 people working full tilt, they couldn't watch every post and wire. Ruth spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "We need to be ready here. If they're bold enough to cut a fence in daylight, they might come closer next time." That thought sat heavy in the room. Jacob saw the flicker of fear in her eyes before she lowered them. But it wasn't the kind of fear that froze a person, it was the kind that made you brace yourself for what had to be done. Jacob set his coffee cup down, the ceramic clinking against the table. "Then we make a plan. We can't stop them from coming, but we can make sure they regret it." The 3 women looked at him, and in that moment he felt the shift, a subtle but undeniable change in the balance between them. Up until now, he'd been the outsider, the man dropped into their lives by the strange terms of a will. He'd worked alongside them, eaten their food, slept under their roof, but he hadn't been part of the Now, without even meaning to, he'd stepped into a different role. Emily tilted her head, studying him. "What are you thinking?" Jacob leaned forward, elbows on the table. "We fortify what matters most. First, the house. This is our anchor. They try to push us off this land. It starts here. Second, the herds. We keep them closer for now, even if it means overgrazing the near pastures for a week or two. Third, we set watches at night. If they try to come in under cover of darkness, they won't find us sleeping. Sarah frowned slightly. That's a lot of hours to cover. I can take the first shifts, Jacob said without hesitation. And I'll teach you what I know about night sentry work. You'll be able to spot movement before it's on top of you. Emily's mouth quirked. Not quite a smile, but something close. Sounds like you've done this before. Jacob didn't elaborate. His past wasn't something he'd laid out for them in full, and now wasn't the time to start. But the truth was, there had been nights in another life before the ranch. Before the Wilwyn, staying awake in the dark and watching for trouble had been the only thing standing between him and disaster. They talked for another hour, the details coming together in slow, deliberate steps. Lanterns by the doors, a shotgun propped near the front window, extra wire and tools ready for quick fence repairs. Horses kept saddled overnight in case they needed to ride out fast. By the time they were done, the lamplight had burned low, and the moon had risen high enough to cast silver over the land. The others drifted off to their rooms, but Jacob stayed behind. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots, and let the night air cool the sweat still lingering on his skin. The ranch lay quiet under the stars. But it was the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath. Somewhere out there, past the dark shapes of the cottonwoods, someone was thinking about this land, maybe even looking at it the way a wolf looks at a sleeping herd. And Jacob knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, or until someone stopped him. He sat in the old rocking chair, the one with the worn armrests where years of hands had rested, and let his mind settle into the kind of focus he hadn't felt in a long time. The will had brought him here under strange, almost laughable terms. But the truth was, it had dropped him exactly where he needed to be. He was no longer here, just to claim an inheritance. He was here to stand between this land, these women, and whatever threatened them. Somewhere in the house, he heard the soft creak of a floorboard. Ruth's shadow appeared in the doorway, the lamplight from behind her, outlining her shape. Can't sleep, she asked. Jacob shook his head. Not tonight. She stepped outside, her bare feet quiet on the wood, and leaned against the porch rail. You know, she said softly, before you came, we were holding on by our fingernails. We worked hard, but it felt like we were always one bad day from losing everything. Jacob didn't answer right away. The words were too close to what he'd been thinking himself. Then we don't let that day come, he said finally. Ruth looked at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. You talk like you mean it. For a moment, they stood in silence, listening to the night, the wind in the grass, the distant call of a coyote, the steady creak of the old chair as it rocked. Then Ruth smiled, a small, tired smile. Good, because I think they're going to come sooner than we expect. Jacob nodded, his jaw tightening. Then we'll be ready. And in that quiet moment, under the stars, he knew the decision had already been made. Not just about the fence, or the watches, or the fight that was coming. He'd decided something deeper, that whatever happened next, he was bound to this ranch, not by a piece of paper in a lawyer's office, but by something harder to break.